As the city's late afternoon light dimmed, Julian Rivera drove home in silence, processing the day's events. At 50 years old, he had just been appointed director of the police department in a southern U.S. city, a historic achievement for both himself and the Black community he represented. His promotion was groundbreaking. He was now in a role even higher than that of the police chief, making him one of the most influential figures in the city's law enforcement. This new role wasn't just a personal victory, it symbolized hope for the community, a long overdue representation of a voice that had been marginalized for decades. Julian knew his appointment was a milestone, not only for himself, but for the countless individuals who had endured injustices that the system had failed to address. For them, seeing a Black man in such a position of power was a reason to believe that change could be possible. Yet as he navigated the city streets, Julian couldn't ignore the immense weight of responsibility that accompanied this position. He could already sense the challenges waiting for him, the resistance he would inevitably encounter. The department was rooted in long-standing practices, many of them relics from a time when law enforcement's approach was more about control than protection, especially for communities of color. Over the years, the city's police force had developed a culture that was insular and deeply conservative, perpetuating a cycle of mistrust between officers and the communities they served. For some officers, Julian's appointment represented an unwelcome shift in the status quo. He could still see the barely veiled skepticism in the eyes of many senior officers during his inauguration ceremony. They had stood beside him, dressed in their formal blues, their faces expressionless. But Julian sensed the underlying tension, the reluctance, and perhaps even resentment. Many of these men had spent their entire careers policing neighborhoods rather than connecting with them. His position, to them, was not a step forward. It was a disruption. Yet as daunting as it all felt, Julian knew he had accepted this role for a reason. As he glanced around at the familiar landmarks of his city, the corner store, the old brick houses, the community center, he thought of the faces he had seen in the crowd during his ceremony. Among the sea of officials and officers were members of the Black community, their expressions filled with cautious hope, some with tears in their eyes. They were there because they saw in him the potential to change things, to finally bridge the gap between the police and the people they were meant to serve. Julian felt a surge of determination. He thought of his mother, Lillian Rivera, a woman who had endured more than her share of discrimination, yet remained steadfast in her belief in justice. She had been a prominent civil rights activist, a woman who had fought for equality and fairness long before it was safe or socially acceptable to do so. Julian remembered how she would return home from rallies and meetings, her voice hoarse but her spirit unbroken. She'd sit him down at their kitchen table, and over a simple meal, she would tell him about the importance of compassion, of understanding, of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. She had faced threats and intimidation, even from the police, yet she had never wavered. Her fight was always fueled by a belief in the possibility of change, and she had instilled that same belief in Julian from a young age. "If you want to change the system, son," she had once told him, "you have to get inside it. That's the only way to shift the tide, to be there, right in the middle of it all, and demand better." That advice had stayed with him through every challenge, every doubt. It was her voice, her teachings that had driven him to pursue a career in law enforcement, a career that would allow him to stand for justice from within a system that had long ignored people like him. Julian hadn't taken the conventional path. He had risen through the ranks as both an officer and a Black man in a largely white, conservative institution. He had faced skepticism, prejudice, and at times outright hostility. But with each promotion, he had felt his mother's legacy pushing him forward, reminding him that every step he took was a step toward fulfilling her vision. As he drove through the streets of his city, he felt the weight of her teachings pressing down on him. He was no longer just Julian Rivera, he was now Director Rivera, responsible for leading a department that had, in many ways, failed the community he came from. He was a symbol of change, but he was also a target for those who wanted to maintain the status quo. His title may have commanded respect, but respect didn't come easily in this field, and he knew that he would need to earn it one step at a time. Julian's thoughts drifted back to the people he had seen at the ceremony, particularly the younger generation. They had looked up at him with a mix of admiration and expectation, hoping he would be the one to make things better, to ensure they wouldn't have to live in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. It was a sobering realization that his actions would affect not just his family or his colleagues, but an entire community. Every decision he made, every policy he implemented, would be scrutinized not only by the department, but by the people he served. He pulled into his driveway, letting the car idle for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. The lights from his house cast a warm glow, a stark contrast to the cold reality of his new role. Inside, his wife Marissa and their son Aaron were waiting for him, their support a constant reminder of why he had taken this position in the first place. They had both sacrificed so much, enduring the long hours, the stress, and the dangers of his career, always standing by him despite the challenges. As he sat there, Julian thought of Aaron, a young black man who had grown up in a world shaped by the same biases and struggles that he himself had faced. Aaron had dreams of his own, ambitions untainted by the harshness of reality. Julian knew that part of his role as director was to pave the way for a future where young men like Aaron wouldn't have to live with the same fears, the same doubts about their worth and their place in society. Finally, Julian turned off the car and stepped out, breathing in the cool evening air. He felt the enormity of his responsibilities settle over him like a heavy cloak. Yet he stood a little taller, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. He would carry her legacy with him, using it as both shield and compass to navigate the challenges ahead. This was more than just a promotion, it was a calling, a chance to be the change his community had longed for. With each step toward his front door, Julian made a silent promise. He would lead with integrity and compassion, fighting for justice within a system that had so often denied it. He would confront the biases, dismantle the prejudices, and rebuild the bridges that had been burned. He would honor his mother's legacy, the hope of his community, in the future of his son. Inside, Marissa and Aaron greeted him, their warm smiles easing the tension that had built up throughout the day. As they sat down together, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his family, his community, his reason for being here. No matter the resistance he would face, no matter the obstacles in his path, he would stand firm. He would carry the weight of his role with pride, determined to transform his department into a force for good, a beacon of trust, respect, and accountability. As the evening wore on, Julian sat by the window, gazing out at the city he was now responsible for. The lights flickered in the distance, each one a reminder of the people depending on him. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with difficult choices and sacrifices, but he was ready, with his mother's teachings as his guide and his family's support as his foundation. Julian Rivera would face the challenges, confront the injustices, and work tirelessly to create a future defined by equality and compassion. For Julian, this was just the beginning, a first step in a journey that would test his resolve, his courage, and his commitment to justice. But he was prepared to face it all, knowing that his fight was not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, and unprotected. The day following his inauguration, Julian was deep in meetings, his thoughts already on setting changes into motion. The energy from the previous day had carried him through hours of discussions and briefings, but his focus was sharpened. He was ready to start making waves. Then came a call he never anticipated. As he picked up the phone, he heard the voice of a young officer he barely recognized, and the words that followed struck him like a blow to the chest. "Mr. Rivera," the officer said, his tone neutral, "we've detained a young man named Aaron Rivera. He identified you as a family member. He was detained on suspicion of unusual activity." Julian's heart pounded. Aaron, his son, detained. He kept his voice level, asking calmly, "Can you explain why Aaron was considered suspicious?" The officer hesitated. "Sir, he was observed walking alone in an area where we've had recent incidents. And, well, his behavior seemed unusual to the officers on duty." The answer felt thin. Julian knew that suspicious activity was often code, a way to justify stopping someone based solely on how they looked. Aaron was a college student, out walking home from the library. Julian felt his anger simmering. but he stayed silent, absorbing each word. The officer, unaware he was speaking to the new director, continued with a routine explanation until Julian finally interrupted him. "Officer, I'd like you to take me to Aaron," he said, keeping his tone cold. The realization must have dawned on the officer at that moment, because Julian heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Sir, Director Rivera, I apologize, sir. We didn't realize," the officer stammered, his tone shifting from routine formality to deep discomfort. Julian remained quiet for a beat, letting the gravity of the situation hang in the air. His own son, treated as suspicious by the very officers he had sworn to lead. It was not just a personal affront, it was a stark reminder of the culture he was trying to change. Finally, he said, "I expect my son to be treated respectfully. I'll handle this myself." When he arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive. Officers stole nervous glances at him, many clearly aware of their mistake. The two officers who had detained Aaron stood at attention, their discomfort clear. Julian moved past them without a word, heading straight to where Aaron was being held. His son was sitting on a bench in the waiting area, looking drained but holding his composure. When he saw Julian, his eyes flashed with a mix of relief and anger. Julian's heart ached as he took in his son's expression, seeing firsthand the frustration of someone unfairly singled out. "Aaron," Julian said quietly, his voice calm but filled with empathy. Aaron's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his face held a tense expression. "Dad," he began, trying to hold back his emotions. "I was just walking. They stopped me, asked questions, and wouldn't let up. They only backed off when they figured out who you were." Julian listened, the weight of Aaron's words sinking in. This was exactly the kind of injustice he was trying to prevent, yet it had happened to his own son, right under his watch. He placed a steadying hand on Aaron's shoulder. "Let's go home," he said, his tone firm. The officers watched silently as Julian escorted his son out of the precinct. The drive home was silent, the tension in the air almost palpable. Julian felt a complex mix of emotions, anger, guilt, and a renewed resolve that now felt deeply personal. He could feel the expectations, not only of his family, but of an entire community that had hoped his appointment would bring change. When they arrived home, Marissa was waiting, her face a mix of relief and concern. As Aaron recounted the incident, Julian saw her expression change to one of hurt and frustration. The weight of her words felt almost accusatory, and Julian couldn't help but feel responsible. "How could this happen, Julian?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You're the director now. Does this mean nothing's changed? Are they even listening to you?" Julian felt the sting of her question, understanding the disappointment behind it. He had hoped that his role would mean his family would be protected from the very system he was trying to reform. But Marissa's question reminded him that they were just as vulnerable as anyone else. "Marissa, I'm sorry. I wish I could have prevented this," he replied, his voice heavy with regret. "But this is exactly why I have to keep pushing. This is why I took the role." She shook her head, her expression filled with sadness. "I want to believe that, Julian, but I just don't know. Can one person really change all of this?" Julian felt a flicker of doubt, but he met her gaze steadily. "I don't know if I can change it all, but I have to try. I can't just walk away. I took this role to make sure things like this don't keep happening. Not to Aaron, not to anyone." Aaron, who had been listening silently, finally spoke, his voice filled with frustration. "It just felt like nothing's different, Dad. Like nothing's really changed. They looked at me and didn't see anything but a threat. It didn't matter who I was or where I was coming from. All they saw was someone who didn't belong." His words cut deep. Julian could hear the pain in his son's voice, a pain born of disappointment and anger at a system that had failed him. He reached out, placing a hand on Aaron's shoulder, feeling the full weight of his responsibility. The encounter became a turning point for Julian. What had started as a mission to bring reform suddenly became a personal crusade. Aaron's experience solidified his resolve, reminding him that the stakes were far higher than he had anticipated. He wasn't just fighting for the abstract concept of justice, he was fighting for his family, his community, and every young person of color who had ever been judged before being understood. In the days that followed, Julian threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He began scrutinizing the department's policies on detainment and profiling, identifying loopholes that allowed for unjustified stops. He launched internal reviews and mandatory training sessions, determined to create a system that valued accountability and transparency. He met with department heads and senior officers, outlining his vision for a department that served and protected without prejudice. He knew his actions would be met with resistance, that there were those who would view his reforms as a threat to their long-held beliefs. But Julian's encounter with Aaron's situation had steeled his resolve. He was no longer just a director enforcing policies. He was a father fighting to ensure his son, and all young men like him, could walk the streets without fear. Each morning as he entered his office, Julian reminded himself of the faces he had seen at his inauguration. The young people looking up at him with hope, the elders who had lived through years of injustice. He carried their expectations with him, using them as fuel to drive his mission forward. He knew the road would be long and challenging, filled with setbacks and difficult choices. But Julian was prepared. This was a fight he couldn't afford to lose, not just for his family, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as he sat at his desk, sifting through reports and strategizing his next moves, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would lead his department with integrity and courage, standing firm in the face of opposition. He would be the change his mother had dreamed of, the leader his community needed, and the protector his family deserved. For Julian, this was no longer just a job. It was a calling, a mission to transform the system from the inside out. And he would fight every day to ensure that the world he left behind was one of justice, equality, and hope for those who came after him. The morning was heavy with a tense anticipation as Julian entered the department. The prior day's incident with his son had left a bitter taste, and he was determined to address it head-on. He had spent a restless night, his mind circling back to the same question. How could his own son, a young man with no criminal history, be detained on mere suspicion? Today, he would demand answers. Julian knew that this was about more than just one wrongful stop. It was about addressing the very mindset that enabled such behavior to persist. He called an emergency meeting with the officers involved in Aaron's detention. As he waited in the conference room, Julian mentally prepared himself. He knew he couldn't allow anger to overshadow his judgment. He needed to approach this with calm but firm authority. When the officers finally entered, they were met with Julian's steady gaze, a look that communicated his expectation for accountability. The room was quiet as Julian looked around, noting the range of expressions on their faces. Some of the younger officers looked nervous, perhaps anticipating his disappointment, but the senior officers, particularly Sergeant Dean, maintained expressions of confidence. Julian had been briefed on Dean's reputation. He was a longtime officer, known for his conservative approach and reliance on traditional methods. Dean was respected within the department, especially by those who shared his belief in a more aggressive approach to policing. Julian began without preamble. Thank you all for joining me. I've called this meeting to discuss yesterday's incident involving my son, Aaron Rivera. I want each of you to provide a clear and honest account of the decisions that led to his detainment. This is an opportunity for us to understand where and how we may need to reevaluate our practices. Officer Daniels, one of the first responders at the scene, cleared his throat nervously. Director Rivera, we were following standard protocol. Aaron was walking alone in a neighborhood flagged for recent disturbances. Given the circumstances, he appeared out of place. Out of place, Julian repeated, his voice calm but sharp. And what specific behavior made him suspicious enough to warrant a stop? Daniels hesitated, looking to Sergeant Dean, who nodded in tacit encouragement. Sir, we've had a series of incidents in that area involving theft and vandalism. We have orders to stay vigilant. When we saw Aaron, he matched a general profile we've been monitoring. A general profile? Julian's voice was measured, though the words struck with a quiet intensity. What does that mean exactly? The room fell silent. Dean, sensing the discomfort building among the younger officers, finally spoke up. Director, with all due respect, we were doing our job. Routine stops like these are an effective tool. They allow us to maintain control and prevent potential crime. This was nothing personal. Julian met Dean's gaze, recognizing the firmness and conviction in his words. Dean truly believed that these actions were justified, that profiling was an essential aspect of keeping the city safe. Julian felt the weight of the room shift, a palpable sense of agreement among several officers, particularly the older ones. "You say it was routine," Julian continued, his tone unwavering. "But let me ask this. Would the same actions have been taken if Aaron had looked different? If he hadn't matched a profile? My son was detained based on assumptions, not evidence." Dean's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "With all due respect, sir, profiling isn't about race. It's about behavior and patterns. We work with what we know and we make quick decisions. It's what keeps us and the citizens safe." Julian nodded slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "I understand that quick decisions are a part of the job, but those decisions need to be grounded in fairness, not assumptions. Safety is important, yes, but not at the cost of trust and respect." He scanned the room, noting the silent nods from some of the younger officers, though Dean and his allies remained impassive. Julian realized that he was speaking to more than just the individuals present. He was challenging an entire culture. The tension in the room was almost tangible, the rift between two philosophies widening. Dean crossed his arms, his tone shifting to one of mild defiance. "Sir, I respect your position, but the men and women in this room have been on the front lines for years. We've seen things that justify the need for precaution. Frankly, if we can't use the tools at our disposal, profiling included, then we're just playing with our hands tied." Several officers murmured in agreement. Julian sensed their underlying fear that changing these methods might compromise their ability to do their jobs. It was clear that Dean was not just speaking for himself. He was voicing the sentiments of many within the department, those who saw profiling as a tool rather than a crutch, a necessary measure rather than an outdated relic. Julian took a deep breath, his voice steady but forceful. "Let me make one thing clear. Profiling based on assumptions rather than evidence is no longer acceptable in this department. I am calling for an internal investigation into yesterday's incident, and moving forward, we will implement new guidelines on conduct and decision-making. Discrimination, in any form, will not be tolerated." A murmur of dissent passed through the room, and Julian could see the skepticism in Dean's eyes. He realized that he had struck at the core of an ingrained culture, one that saw his approach as idealistic at best and dangerous at worst. Dean spoke up, his voice laced with barely concealed frustration. "Director, I understand the need for fairness, but these changes you're proposing, they aren't practical. This is how we keep control in our neighborhoods. We're not just dealing with law-abiding citizens. There are real threats out there." Julian didn't flinch, meeting Dean's challenge with unyielding resolve. "I'm well aware of the threats, Sergeant. I've been in this field for years and I understand the challenges, but respect and justice cannot be compromised in the name of control. If we're truly here to serve and protect, then that service must be extended to every member of our community, not just those who fit a certain image." The room fell silent once again, a quiet tension hanging in the air. Julian knew that this was just the beginning of a long struggle. He was not only confronting a flawed system, but an entire culture that viewed change as a threat to their authority and security. He concluded the meeting with a firm directive. "Effective immediately, we will begin implementing bias training across the department with regular reviews to assess our conduct. I want everyone in this room to understand that this department is changing, and these changes are not optional. We owe it to the people we serve, to those who trust us to protect them without prejudice." As the officers filed out of the room, Julian felt the weight of the challenge before him settle heavily on his shoulders. He could sense the reluctance, the silent resistance in each step. It was evident that Dean, and those who agreed with him, saw his directives as more of a threat than an opportunity. But Julian knew that this confrontation was necessary, that addressing the biases embedded in the department's culture was the only way to achieve true reform. Back in his office, Julian allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He understood that change would not come easily, that he would face resistance at every turn. The culture he had just confronted was not born overnight. It was the result of years of practices and beliefs that had been allowed to fester, unchecked and unquestioned. Now, as director, it was his responsibility to dismantle those practices and replace them with principles of fairness and integrity. He spent the remainder of the day outlining a comprehensive plan to address the cultural biases he had witnessed. He drafted proposals for extensive training programs, mandatory community engagement, and regular evaluations to ensure accountability. These reforms would be the foundation of a new era for the department, one rooted in respect and empathy rather than suspicion and control. As evening fell, Julian looked out his office window at the city he had sworn to protect. He thought of Aaron, of his family, and of the countless young men and women who had endured similar experiences. They were the reason he was here, the reason he would keep fighting, no matter how difficult the journey became. In the coming days, Julian knew he would need allies, both within the department and from the community. He would need to build bridges, to foster trust and collaboration where there was currently fear and division. But he was prepared. This was his mission now, his purpose, to create a department that served all people equally, a force for justice rather than judgment. With renewed resolve, Julian set his shoulders and prepared for the battle ahead. The journey to transform the department would be challenging, but he was ready to face it, driven by a belief that justice was worth every sacrifice. The weight of the department's resistance to change was heavy on Julian's shoulders, but he knew that he couldn't wage this battle alone. If he wanted to implement real reform, he would need to connect with the community and draw strength from those who shared his vision of justice and equality. He needed allies, people outside the department who believed in his mission and were willing to stand with him. His thoughts turned to Elena Cruz, a longtime activist and advocate for racial justice in the community. Elena had been a close friend of his late mother, both of them fearless in their pursuit of civil rights. For years, Elena had been a powerful voice against police discrimination, attending countless city council meetings, leading marches, and organizing neighborhood coalitions. Her story was deeply personal. She had lost a nephew to an incident of police violence years ago. The memory of that tragedy had shaped her life's mission, to build a community where such injustices would never happen again. Julian reached out to Elena, and they arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the heart of the community. The location was one of her favorites, a modest, bustling place where neighbors came to chat and exchange stories. Julian entered, spotting her immediately. Despite her petite frame, Elena had a presence that commanded attention. She greeted him warmly, her eyes kind but assessing, as if searching for the same fire she had once seen in his mother's eyes. They exchanged pleasantries before settling into their conversation. Julian didn't waste time getting to the point. He outlined his plans to reform the police department, emphasizing his goal to root out discriminatory practices and foster a culture of accountability. But as he spoke, he could see that Elena wasn't going to be won over by words alone. "Julian," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I admire what you're trying to do. But you know as well as I do that promises of change have been made before, and the community has seen very little follow-through. People are tired. They're tired of broken promises, and they're tired of being treated like second-class citizens. We've been let down too many times." Julian nodded, understanding her skepticism. He had anticipated this. "Elena, I'm not here to make empty promises," he replied. "I'm here to work with you, to build something sustainable. But I can't do it without your help, without the support of the community. I want to make the department transparent and accountable, and that means listening to the people we're supposed to serve." Elena studied him for a moment, then leaned back, crossing her arms thoughtfully. "If you're serious about this, then it can't just be a one-time effort. The community needs a voice, a consistent, ongoing way to express concerns, to have a seat at the table." She suggested organizing regular open forums where residents could directly share their grievances, ideas, and hopes with the department. These gatherings, she believed, would serve as a bridge, building trust and allowing the community to hold the department accountable. Julian listened intently, recognizing the value of her proposal. He had already considered ways to increase transparency, but Elena's suggestion was practical, grassroots-focused, and exactly the kind of community-centered initiative he wanted to embrace. "I think that's exactly what we need, Elena," Julian said. "An open forum where people feel comfortable, where they know their voices matter. Let's start with a town hall meeting, something informal but structured enough to allow people to feel safe expressing themselves. I want people to know they'll be heard, and I want to show the department that we're serious about accountability." Elena's expression softened, a spark of approval in her eyes. "A town hall could be a good start," she agreed, "but you'll need more than just a few forums. Consistency is key. People need to see that this isn't just a publicity stunt. They need to see change in the way officers interact with them, in how they're treated on the streets. Without that, these meetings will mean little." Her words resonated deeply with Julian. He had always respected Elena's perspective, knowing that her insights came from years of on-the-ground experience. He realized that for the community to truly believe in his reforms, he would need to make these forums regular, to give people a true platform for engagement. Together, they began sketching out plans for the first town hall. Julian suggested holding it in a community center, a neutral space where people could feel comfortable. They agreed that the tone needed to be open, approachable, and collaborative. No uniforms, no hierarchy, just a place for honest conversation. As they delved deeper into planning, Elena brought up the importance of accountability measures for the department. "Julian, you need to make sure there are consequences when officers cross the line. Without accountability, any trust you build will crumble. People need to see that you're serious about holding your officers to a higher standard." Julian nodded. "I agree. That's why I'm establishing an oversight committee with representatives from the community to monitor our actions and review complaints. It'll give us a system of checks and balances, something transparent and fair. And I want you to be part of it, Elena. You understand the community's needs better than anyone." For a moment, Elena looked surprised, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. She hadn't expected him to extend such an invitation, but she saw the sincerity in his eyes. She considered his offer carefully, recognizing both the weight of the role and the potential it held. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "If you're serious about this, then I'm in. But understand, Julian, this won't be easy. The community has scars, and it'll take more than policies and meetings to heal them." Julian reached across the table, offering his hand. "I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you, Elena." They shook hands, solidifying their partnership. For Julian, this wasn't just an alliance. It was a bridge to the community, a pathway to the heart of the people he wanted to serve. He knew that Elena's support would be invaluable in fostering trust and credibility, especially in the early stages of his reforms. As they left the coffee shop, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Elena by his side, he was more confident in his vision. She was a respected figure, someone the community trusted implicitly, and her involvement would lend legitimacy to his efforts. Together, they could begin the difficult process of rebuilding trust and reshaping the department's relationship with the community. Over the next few days, Julian worked tirelessly to organize the town hall, reaching out to local leaders, coordinating with community centers, and rallying department resources to ensure the event's success. He was determined to make it an event that people would remember, a space where they could see that change was not just a promise, but a reality in the making. Elena was equally active, spreading the word among her networks, encouraging people to attend, and assuring them that this was a genuine opportunity to be heard. Her reputation as a steadfast advocate gave her words weight, and people began to take notice. Conversations sparked across neighborhoods, with residents curious and cautiously hopeful about the town hall. Finally, the evening of the meeting arrived. The community center was bustling, filled with people from all walks of life: students, elders, families, local business owners. Julian arrived early, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. He knew that this was his chance to show the community that he was committed to making real change. Elena joined him, offering a reassuring nod as they prepared to address the crowd. The atmosphere was tense but expectant, and Julian could see the skepticism in some eyes, the guarded hope in others. He began with a simple message, acknowledging the hurt and mistrust that had developed over the years, and expressing his commitment to rebuilding their relationship with the department. "I know that words alone won't heal the wounds," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "But I'm here to listen, and I'm here to work with you. This isn't just a department issue, it's a community issue, and we're going to address it together." The town hall opened the floor to voices that had long felt ignored. People shared personal stories of encounters with law enforcement, expressing their frustrations and fears, but also their hopes for a better future. Julian listened to each person with respect and empathy, noting their concerns and promising to address them. Elena, seated beside him, interjected at times, bridging the gap between the community's pain and Julian's intentions. Her presence was a reminder that this was a collaborative effort, that Julian was not alone in this mission. Together, they assured the community that their voices would shape the changes to come. By the end of the evening, Julian sensed a shift in the room. It wasn't complete trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. People left the town hall with a sense that, perhaps for the first time, someone in power was truly listening. As Julian and Elena locked up the center, he turned to her, feeling a profound gratitude. "Thank you, Elena. I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, her eyes reflecting both hope and caution. "This is just the beginning, Julian. You've earned their attention, but trust will take time. Just keep listening, and don't lose sight of why you started this." Julian nodded, her words grounding him. He knew the path ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. With allies like Elena, he believed that real, lasting change was within reach. The atmosphere within the department had grown tense. Julian's initial reforms had been met with quiet resistance, but he knew that change on the scale he envisioned would never come easily. As he rolled out his initiatives, mandatory bias training, community engagement programs, and the newly established Oversight Committee, he could feel a rising undercurrent of opposition. At the center of this pushback was Sergeant Dean. Though Julian had sensed Dean's reluctance during their previous encounters, he hadn't anticipated the lengths to which the sergeant would go to preserve the old ways. For Dean, Julian's reforms threatened everything he believed the department stood for: discipline, order, and what he saw as a traditional approach to policing. He was wary of the changes, seeing them not as progress, but as an erosion of authority and a favoring of certain groups over others. Dean and a small but influential group of conservative officers began holding secret meetings, convening after hours in the back room of a local bar. It was a discreet location, away from the scrutiny of the department, and one where they felt free to speak their minds. The discussions were strategic but laced with bitterness, focused on how to curb Julian's influence and preserve the true spirit of the department. "This isn't what the department's about," Dean said one night, addressing the group with his usual bluntness. "We're here to keep order, to enforce the law, not to cater to community demands or worry about political correctness." Several officers nodded in agreement, their expressions grim. They were all veterans, men and women who had been with the department for decades and had grown comfortable in the old ways of doing things. They saw Julian's reforms as a disruption, an unwelcome change that challenged their authority and questioned their methods. "He's bending over backward for the black community," one officer muttered, "making it look like we're the villains, as if we're the problem." Dean seized on this sentiment, fanning the flames. "Exactly. He's turning the department into a circus, and if we don't do something, he's going to destroy everything we've worked for." As the meetings continued, Dean and his allies began spreading rumors throughout the department. They painted Julian's reforms as favoritism, claiming that he was more concerned with appeasing the black community than maintaining discipline and security. Dean's words were carefully chosen, aimed at sowing seeds of distrust among the rank and file. "Julian's not looking out for the department," Dean would say, his voice low but insidious. "He's looking out for himself and his image. These reforms aren't about making things better. They're about making him look good to the community. He's trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist." The rumors spread like wildfire. Officers who had once been neutral or even cautiously supportive of Julian's initiatives began to question his motives. Conversations grew heated in the break rooms and locker rooms, where officers debated the necessity of the reforms. Some voiced support for Julian, insisting that change was overdue, but others echoed Dean's words, viewing the reforms as unnecessary and divisive. Julian soon became aware of the tension. He noticed the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that abruptly stopped when he entered a room. Even among his senior staff, he sensed a growing unease, as if they were waiting for him to prove himself. His presence in the department once seen as a potential force for positive change, was now perceived as a disruption. He felt the sting of betrayal acutely, especially when he learned that some of the rumors had come from officers he had thought were allies. These officers, though initially open to his ideas, had been swayed by Dean's insidious campaign, questioning whether Julian's reforms were truly in the department's best interest. But Julian remained resolute. He knew that meaningful change required more than policy. It required a shift in culture, in mindset. And that shift was bound to create friction, especially among those who had benefited from the old ways. He understood that Dean's resistance was rooted in fear, a fear of losing power, of being forced to question long-held beliefs. But Julian also knew that if he didn't push forward, if he allowed this resistance to intimidate him, he would never achieve the transformative change he sought. Determined to address the growing divide, Julian began working more closely with officers who showed genuine interest in the reforms. He scheduled meetings with younger officers, those who were less entrenched in the department's traditional mindset and more open to new perspectives. He encouraged them to speak freely, to share their thoughts on how the department could improve. Many of them were eager to see change, to work in an environment that valued respect and fairness as much as discipline and order. One such officer was Tommy Young, a young patrol officer who had joined the department with the hope of making a difference. Tommy had seen firsthand how community mistrust made policing more challenging, and he believed that Julian's approach, though ambitious, was necessary. He became one of Julian's quiet allies, speaking up in favor of the reforms whenever conversations turned negative. In private, Tommy warned Julian about the influence Dean wielded among the senior officers. "Sir, you've got a lot of people on your side," he said one afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting. "But Dean's been here a long time. A lot of the older guys look up to him. They trust him. If he's telling them you're a threat to the department, they're going to believe it." Julian listened carefully, appreciating Tommy's candor. He knew that Dean's influence was formidable, but he also knew that the path to reform lay not in silencing opposition, but in addressing it directly. "Thank you, Tommy," Julian replied, his voice steady. "I need people like you, officers who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Julian decided to confront Dean's resistance more openly. He called a department-wide meeting, addressing the rumors head-on. Standing at the front of the room, he looked out at the faces before him, some neutral, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. "I know there are concerns about the changes we're implementing," he began, his voice steady and calm. "I know some of you feel that these reforms are unnecessary, that they compromise the integrity of the department. But let me be clear. These changes are not about catering to one community over another. They are about ensuring that we fulfill our duty to protect and serve all members of our community with fairness and respect." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "These reforms aren't about undermining tradition or taking away authority. They are about strengthening the foundation of this department, about building a culture that values integrity as much as it values security. And that means holding ourselves to a higher standard, one that the community can trust." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Dean stood near the back, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Julian looked directly at him, making it clear that he understood the challenge he was up against. "Change is never easy," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But it is necessary. I won't pretend that this will be a smooth process, and I won't pretend that everyone here will agree with every decision I make. But I ask that you trust my intentions. I am here to make this department better, to restore trust, and to build a legacy of fairness and justice." When the meeting ended, Julian saw the impact of his words on the faces of the officers. Some looked thoughtful, their expressions softened as they considered his perspective. Others, however, were still skeptical, Dean among them. Julian knew he hadn't won over everyone, but he had planted a seed, one that he hoped would grow over time. In the days that followed, the department remained divided. Dean continued to hold his secret meetings, but Julian's message had reached enough officers to prevent the resistance from spreading unchecked. Officers like Tommy began speaking up more openly in support of the reforms, challenging the negative rhetoric with their own experiences and beliefs. Julian also strengthened his connection with the community, working closely with Elena to ensure that the reforms addressed the issues that mattered most to the people. Together, they organized more forums, inviting residents to share their stories and concerns. Julian used these sessions not only to listen, but to demonstrate to his officers the impact of their work, the importance of community trust. As he navigated the opposition within his department, Julian understood that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. Dean's influence was strong, and the resistance was deeply rooted, but he was undeterred. For every voice that spoke against him, Julian found another that supported him, officers who believed in the vision he was trying to create. Slowly but steadily, he began to build a coalition of allies within the department, officers who understood that the old ways had to change. They might not yet have Dean's influence, but they had something equally powerful, a commitment to fairness, justice, and the belief that they could make a difference. The battle for the soul of the department was just beginning, but Julian was ready. With each step forward, he moved closer to his goal, a department that served with integrity, a department that respected the community it was sworn to protect. And as the lines between the past and the future continued to shift, Julian knew he was prepared to face whatever resistance lay ahead. The tension surrounding the department had been simmering for weeks, but the news of Julian's son's unjust detention had brought things to a head. When the community learned of the incident, the response was swift. Word spread through the neighborhoods and social networks, fueled by a deep-seated frustration that had been building for years. This incident wasn't just another case of profiling, it was a breach of trust, a reminder of the injustice that too many families in the community faced. Elena Cruz, the relentless community leader and Julian's ally, was one of the first to act. As soon as she heard about Aaron's detention, she mobilized her network, organizing a protest to demand answers and accountability from the department. She reached out to other community leaders, activists, and local residents who shared her sense of outrage. By the morning of the protest, word had spread to neighboring communities, with more people planning to join the demonstration in solidarity. The protest began just outside the police station, with a small group of residents carrying signs and banners calling for transparency and justice. The crowd quickly grew, with people of all ages gathering, their voices joining in chants, demanding an end to racial profiling and calling for accountability. The signs they held were blunt and powerful, messages scrawled in bold letters: "Justice for all," "End the discrimination," "Hold police accountable." The community was no longer asking for change, they were demanding it. Inside the department, the atmosphere was tense and charged. Officers watched the protest from behind the windows, some visibly uncomfortable, others irritated by the disruption. To many of them, this was unfamiliar territory. Protests had happened before, but never had they come so close to home, so personally connected to one of their own. And to the conservative faction within the department, led by Sergeant Dean, this protest was seen as a direct consequence of Julian's leadership. Dean saw this as his moment. He had been waiting for an opportunity to undermine Julian, to show the department that their new director's approach was causing chaos. He gathered a group of like-minded officers in the break room, his voice carrying an edge of triumph. "This is exactly what I warned you about," he said, gesturing toward the crowd outside. "Julian's reforms, his coddling of the community, it's destabilizing us. We're supposed to be enforcing the law, not pandering to protesters." Some of the officers nodded in agreement, murmuring their discontent. To them, the protest felt like an attack, a challenge to their authority. They didn't see it as a demand for justice. They saw it as a rejection of their work, of everything they believed they were protecting. Dean seized on this, casting Julian as a disruptor who was compromising their strength and eroding the values of the department. Meanwhile, Julian sat in his office, fully aware of the activity outside. He could hear the distant chants through the walls, each one a reminder of the urgency of his mission. The protest wasn't just about Aaron. It was about every family who had felt the sting of prejudice, every individual who had been profiled and mistrusted. Julian knew he had to respond. He couldn't ignore the voices outside, and he couldn't allow Dean's narrative to dominate the department. Taking a deep breath, Julian made a decision. He would step outside, face the crowd directly, and address their concerns head-on. He stood up and straightened his uniform, preparing himself for the confrontation. As he walked through the halls toward the main entrance, he could feel the eyes of his officers on him, some filled with curiosity, others with skepticism. Dean, standing nearby, watched him with barely concealed disdain. "You really think this is the right move, sir?" Dean asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fueling the fire?" Julian paused, meeting Dean's gaze with a steely determination. "I think listening to the community we serve is the right move, Sergeant. This isn't about fueling anything, it's about accountability." Dean smirked, crossing his arms. "Well, good luck out there. They're not here to thank you." Ignoring Dean's comment, Julian pushed open the door and stepped outside. The crowd fell quiet as they saw him approach, their expressions a mix of anger, frustration, and expectation. Julian could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the collective emotion of a community that had been waiting too long for someone to stand with them. Elena, standing near the front of the crowd, met his gaze with a steady look of encouragement. Julian took a step forward, raising his hands to signal for silence. When the crowd quieted, he began to speak, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I know why you're here," Julian said, his words carrying across the plaza, "and I understand your anger. The incident with my son should never have happened, but it did, and that's why I'm here. To acknowledge that fact and to assure you that this department is taking it seriously." A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding in cautious agreement, others folding their arms, waiting for more. "Let me be clear," Julian continued. "As long as I am director, this department will be accountable to the people it serves. We will investigate this incident thoroughly, and any officer found to have acted with bias will face consequences. This isn't just about my son, it's about every one of you who has felt the impact of unjust treatment. And it's about making sure that our actions reflect the values of fairness, respect, and integrity." A voice from the crowd shouted, "We've heard this before. What makes you different?" Julian looked in the direction of the voice, nodding. "I understand your skepticism. I know that promises have been made and broken in the past. But I'm not here to make empty promises. I'm here to take action, and I'm here to work with you to ensure that those actions bring real change. I want this to be a department you can trust, a department that listens to your concerns, and I need your help to get there." His words seemed to resonate with some in the crowd. Elena nodded approvingly, her expression softening as she saw Julian's sincerity. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in the faces of the protesters. Julian could feel a shift, a small but significant change in the energy around him. The community wasn't entirely convinced, but they were listening. Inside, Dean watched the exchange from the window, his jaw clenched. Julian's actions were to him a blatant betrayal of the department. He muttered under his breath to a fellow officer, "This is just the beginning. You give them an inch and they'll take a mile. Mark my words, this department is heading for a fall if this keeps up." Back outside, Julian continued to engage with the crowd, answering questions, addressing concerns, and vowing to follow through on his commitment to transparency. By the end of the gathering, the crowd's anger had softened, replaced by a cautious optimism. Some still held their doubts, but they saw in Julian a leader who was willing to stand with them, to face their frustrations and not hide behind his title. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena approached Julian, her expression one of gratitude. "You handled that well," she said. "They needed to see that you're with them, that you're not just another figurehead making promises." Julian nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. "I meant what I said, Elena. This is just the beginning, but I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust." Elena placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I believe you, and so does the community. We're behind you, Julian, but stay vigilant. There are those inside and outside this department who want to see you fail." As Julian returned inside, he was met with a range of expressions from his officers, some admiring, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Dean, standing near the back of the group, gave him a look of pure disdain before walking away. Julian knew that Dean's resistance was growing stronger, that his attempt to undermine the reforms would only intensify. But Julian also knew that he had taken a crucial step forward. By addressing the community directly, he had shown them that he was committed to change, that he was willing to listen and respond. It was a small victory, but an important one. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Julian was prepared. With the support of the community, he knew he could withstand the internal resistance, no matter how intense it became. As he walked back to his office, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. The protest had been a test of his leadership, a test of his commitment to justice, and he had passed. Now he would carry that momentum forward, continuing to fight for the reform he believed in, no matter the opposition. This was the path he had chosen, the path he would walk, one that demanded courage, resilience, and a steadfast commitment to the values he had promised to uphold. The community was watching, and so was his department. Julian knew he couldn't afford to falter. His next steps would determine not just his future, but the future of the department and the trust of the people he served. Julian's decision to publicly address the community had strengthened his resolve. He knew that the community expected action, not just words, and he was determined to deliver on his promises. The time had come to take a decisive step forward. To show the people that he was serious about accountability, Julian began working on the formation of an independent oversight committee, one that would give the community a direct voice in the department's operations. This committee would be composed of respected community leaders, representatives from human rights organizations, and other stakeholders. Its mission was clear: to review cases of officer misconduct, ensure transparency in investigations, and recommend disciplinary actions. Julian was determined to root out discriminatory practices and to create a system that held officers accountable for their actions. Setting up the committee wasn't easy. Julian faced immediate pushback from within the department, especially from Dean and his supporters. The resistance, though expected, was stronger and more vocal than ever. Dean saw the committee as a blatant threat to the department's autonomy, arguing that civilians had no place interfering in police matters. He viewed the Oversight Committee as an attack on the department's integrity, a betrayal of trust that could weaken their authority. One afternoon, as Julian sat in a staff meeting to discuss the logistics of the committee's formation, Dean spoke up, his tone laced with frustration. "With all due respect, Director Rivera, involving civilians in internal matters compromises our ability to do our jobs. We know what it takes to keep order in this city. Outsiders don't." Julian met Dean's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "This committee isn't about undermining our work, Sergeant. It's about building trust with the community. We serve them, and they deserve transparency. If we have nothing to hide, then there's no reason to resist oversight." Dean's jaw tightened, and he glanced around the room, his allies nodding in agreement with his unspoken dissent. Julian knew that winning over this faction would be difficult, if not impossible. But he also knew that backing down was not an option. His vision for the department was non-negotiable. Over the next few weeks, Julian worked tirelessly to assemble the committee, consulting with Elena Cruz and other respected leaders in the community. Elena's involvement was instrumental. She had the connections and trust of the people, and her participation in the committee lent it credibility. Together, they selected a diverse group of individuals with backgrounds in law, social work, and community advocacy. Julian was careful to choose members who understood the importance of fair policing, but who were also unafraid to hold officers accountable. When the committee was officially announced, it sparked both excitement and skepticism within the community. Many saw it as a long overdue step toward justice, a chance to finally hold the department accountable. Others were more cautious, wondering if this was just another temporary measure, something that would fade once the pressure lifted. But Julian was committed. He personally assured each member of the committee that they would have his full support and access to the resources they needed. With the committee in place, Julian turned his attention to the next phase of his plan: disciplinary action for the officers involved in Aaron's detention, including Dean. This decision was not made lightly. Julian understood the risks of taking such a public stand against officers within his department, especially high-ranking ones. But he also knew that if he allowed bias and abuse to go unchecked, his reforms would lose all credibility. The investigation was swift and thorough, led by a team of legal experts and reviewed by the newly formed Oversight Committee. The findings were clear. The officers involved had acted on implicit bias, detaining Aaron without just cause. The committee recommended a series of disciplinary actions, ranging from formal warnings to transfers. Dean, who had led the officers involved, was among those disciplined. Though his actions did not warrant suspension, he was transferred to a different precinct, a move that sent a powerful message to the rest of the department. The response to these actions was immediate and intense. Within the department, reactions ranged from shock to anger. Dean supporters viewed the disciplinary measures as a betrayal, an overreach that threatened the unity of the force. Conversations in the break rooms and locker rooms grew heated, with some officers questioning Julian's leadership, accusing him of being more interested in appeasing the community than supporting his own people. Julian, however, held his ground. He knew that standing firm in the face of resistance was essential to building a culture of accountability. The community needed to see that he was serious, that his commitment to justice extended to everyone, including his own officers. And while the backlash within the department was fierce, Julian began to notice a subtle shift among the more neutral officers, those who hadn't chosen a side in the ongoing struggle between him and Dean. Some of these officers began to see Julian's resolve not as a threat, but as a sign of strength. They respected his willingness to make difficult decisions, even if it meant alienating powerful figures within the department. For the first time, Julian sensed a change in the atmosphere, small but significant. A few officers began approaching him with questions about the reforms, expressing curiosity about the oversight committee, and even suggesting ideas for improving community relations. One afternoon, Officer Tommy Young, who had quietly supported Julian from the beginning, stopped by his office. "Director Rivera," Tommy began, his voice hesitant but respectful, "I just wanted to say, I know a lot of us are feeling unsure about all these changes, but I think you're doing the right thing. We need this. The community needs this." Julian looked up, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Tommy. It means a lot to hear that. I know this isn't easy, but change rarely is. And I'm grateful to have officers like you who understand that." As word of the Oversight Committee and the disciplinary actions spread, the community's reaction was overwhelmingly positive. For many, it was the first time they had seen a department official take such a bold stand, not just with words, but with concrete actions. Community members began attending committee meetings, voicing their concerns and sharing their experiences. For Julian, this was a crucial step forward. The transparency he had promised was beginning to take shape, and with each meeting, the committee grew stronger, more confident in its role. Elena, who had been instrumental in establishing the committee, reached out to Julian to share her thoughts. "Julian, I can't tell you how much this means to us," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "People are starting to believe that change is possible. They're starting to believe in you." Julian nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "This is just the beginning, Elena. We still have a long way to go, but I'm committed to seeing this through. I won't let up." In the weeks that followed, the department began implementing the committee's recommendations on other cases of misconduct, cases that had previously been ignored or mishandled. Officers began undergoing mandatory bias training, and Julian introduced new protocols for reporting and addressing complaints. Though the changes were met with resistance, Julian's firm stance had made it clear there would be no tolerance for discrimination or abuse of power. Gradually, the attitude within the department began to shift. While Dean and his staunch supporters remained critical, others started to see the value in Julian's approach. The committee's involvement brought a level of transparency that fostered trust, both within the department and in the community. Officers who had once doubted Julian's intentions began to respect his determination, recognizing that his goal wasn't to undermine them, but to create a department they could all be proud of. As Julian walked through the precinct one evening, he overheard two officers talking quietly in the hallway. "You know," one of them said, "I didn't think much of Rivera's changes at first, but I think he's on to something. Maybe we did need a wake-up call." The other officer nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, it's different, but maybe it's the kind of different we needed." Julian felt a quiet satisfaction as he continued down the hallway. The path to reform was long and arduous, but he was beginning to see the fruits of his labor. Slowly, the walls of resistance were starting to crack, and he knew that each step forward was building a stronger foundation for the future. As the day ended, Julian sat in his office, reflecting on the progress they had made. The Oversight Committee had become a powerful tool for accountability, and the disciplinary actions had set a precedent that would resonate for years to come. He knew that challenges still lay ahead, that Dean and his supporters would continue to resist. But he also knew that the tides were shifting. For the first time since he'd taken on this role, Julian felt a true sense of accomplishment. The department was beginning to change, and with each passing day, the community's trust grew stronger. There was still much work to be done, but he was no longer walking this path alone. With the support of the community, the oversight committee, and officers who believed in his mission, Julian knew that real change was not just possible, it was happening. And as he prepared for the next phase of his reforms, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Julian Rivera stepped out of the precinct. The building behind him, often a symbol of tension and authority, now carried a different weight. For years, it had represented a system marred by bias and distrust, a place feared by many in the community. But tonight, it felt like a place where hope had taken root, a place on the verge of transformation. Julian took a deep breath, allowing himself a rare moment of reflection. The past months had been filled with intense challenges, from the blatant resistance within his ranks to the urgent demands of a community that had been let down time and again. But with each step he took, each meeting, each conversation, each act of accountability, he felt a subtle but undeniable shift. This wasn't a victory march. It was the beginning of a journey, a long and winding path toward lasting change. As he walked down the precinct steps, he saw Elena Cruz standing nearby, talking to a group of young community members who had come to meet her. Elena noticed him and approached, her face breaking into a smile that carried both pride and relief. They had faced these battles together, and the mutual respect between them had only deepened as they saw the early fruits of their labor. "Evening, Director Rivera," she greeted him playfully, but with warmth. "How does it feel to be leading the first department in this city's history to have a true oversight committee?" Julian chuckled, shaking his head. "Feels like we're still at the starting line, but I think we're facing in the right direction." Elena nodded, her expression serious but encouraging. "You've done more than just turn the ship, Julian. People are talking. They're starting to believe that this department can be different." They both paused, watching as some of the younger community members passed by, glancing at Julian with quiet admiration. For so long, trust between the community and the department had been broken. But now there was a cautious hope, a growing belief that maybe, just maybe, the police department could serve as a force for good. Reflecting on his journey, Julian thought of the officers who had initially doubted his reforms but were now beginning to understand his vision. The small yet critical victories, the establishment of the Oversight Committee, the disciplinary actions against those who had mistreated his son, and the steps toward transparency had set the groundwork for something bigger. Inside the precinct, he had noticed subtle changes. Conversations that had once been filled with skepticism or resistance now carried a tone of cautious optimism. Officers who had once been neutral or even opposed to his reforms were starting to speak up in support of fair treatment and transparency. Even Tommy Young, the young officer who had backed him from the start, had shared that other junior officers were now curious, open to learning more about how they could better serve the community. Despite these signs of progress, Julian knew he couldn't afford complacency. Change this deep and systemic wouldn't happen overnight, and he was prepared for the setbacks that would inevitably come. There were still powerful voices within the department, like Dean and his supporters, who would continue to resist. But Julian was ready. He had laid a foundation, and now he had to build upon it, brick by brick. As he walked Elena to her car, they continued to discuss future initiatives, more community forums, additional oversight measures, and the possibility of increasing the community's role in department policy. It was ambitious, but Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. With every small step, they were reinforcing the fragile bridge between the police and the people, creating a structure that would withstand the weight of future storms. After Elena left, Julian decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He passed by familiar landmarks, churches, small businesses, community centers, places he had frequented as a younger man. The streets were quieter now, the bustle of the day replaced by a calm that only the night could bring. He felt a deep connection to this community, to the people who lived and worked here, and he was more determined than ever to create a department that reflected the values of those it served. As he rounded the corner, he saw a group of teenagers laughing and talking near a local cafe. They glanced his way, some offering tentative waves. Julian gave a nod, recognizing the glances of curiosity and respect. He knew that they too were watching him, looking to him for proof that change was possible. One of the teens called out, "You're Julian Rivera, right? The new director?" Julian smiled and approached them, his hands casually in his pockets. "That's right, and you all are the future of this city." The group laughed, but there was a seriousness in their eyes. "We heard about the committee and all that," one of them said. "Do you really think it's going to make a difference?" Julian looked at them earnestly. "I believe it will, but it's not just about what I think. It's about what all of you think. We're building this together, and it's going to take all of us working for a safer, fairer community." The teen nodded, seemingly satisfied. As Julian turned to leave, he felt a surge of motivation. It was moments like these, small as they were, that reminded him of the importance of his mission. This wasn't just about reforming a department. It was about giving young people a reason to believe in justice, to see the police as protectors rather than threats. Returning to the precinct, Julian allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection in his office. He thought about the people who had inspired him, the memory of his mother, who had instilled in him a fierce commitment to justice, Elena, who had supported him even when the odds seemed insurmountable, and his son, Aaron, whose ordeal had strengthened his resolve. Julian's mission was not just professional, it was personal. It was a promise to all those who had faced injustice and a commitment to create a legacy his family could be proud of. In the corner of his office sat a framed photograph of his mother, her gaze as resolute as he felt. Julian picked up the frame, feeling her strength as if it were flowing through him. "This is just the beginning, Mom," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I won't let you down." As he prepared to head home, Julian felt a deep sense of responsibility, tempered by hope. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but he was ready. With each passing day, he was proving that leadership wasn't just about holding power. It was about serving, about being accountable, and about uplifting those around him. He locked his office, walking through the precinct one last time before leaving. He noticed a few officers lingering, some nodding respectfully as he passed. They were beginning to see him not just as their director, but as a leader with a vision, someone who understood the weight of the badge they wore. As he stepped outside, the night was cool and calm, the stars visible against the dark sky. Julian paused, looking out over the city he had sworn to protect and serve. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. And with every step he took, he was working to make it better. He took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of the journey still ahead. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He felt the support of his community, the respect of his allies, and the unwavering guidance of those who had inspired him. This was more than just a job. It was a calling, one he intended to honor every day. With resolve in his heart and a promise on his lips, Julian Rivera walked into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was building something that would endure.